So we have a lot of people trickling in. We have more than 150 people that signed up for today's webinar. Many more are interested in seeing the recording because everyone is interested in scaling mental health care. So before jumping straight into the questions that I have for you all, maybe a question that I like to ask everyone is what is a book that you have recommended most to people? Maybe Gaurai, maybe you can start.
Yeah, it's challenging to sort of pick one singular book to say this is the one that I recommend, because I usually have a running list of books that I'm going through. But one that keeps on coming up in my reading again and again is Radical Candor by Kim Scott. Um, it's honestly been instrumental in shaping my leadership style. The concepts of caring deeply and challenging directly are very aligned with my inherent style. And the book sort of validated that for me and allowed me to lean in confidently into it and sort of see the impactful results that come from it. So that's one book that I always recommend to everyone.
I love that book as well. So it's definitely a good one. Laura, what about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that book as well. And Gaurai really embodies pretty much everything that book is about. So I think that's a perfect answer for you, Gaurai. For me, I'm the type of person that is reading 3 to 4 books at the same time. And, there's a fun book, there's a workbook, there's topical books. But the one that I've really enjoyed recently, and I've talked about this a bunch at work, there's a book that has become quite popular recently called The Anxious Generation. And it speaks about the mental health situation that our youth in today's society are experiencing, the trends, the impact of smartphones and social media on youth mental health. And as a new parent, actually, my son just turned 6 months today. So as a new parent, it really shapes how I think about how I want to bring my son up in today's society. And it also shapes how we approach providing mental health care for children from a work perspective. So excited to dive more into that today.
And so I know that this is not a parental podcast or like session, but what's like the one takeaway for you from like and like raising your son that you will apply? Is it like less smartphones, or what is it like the main
Yeah,
takeaway from the book?
so as of right now, and I just finished the book a couple of weeks ago, my perspective is that children need real physical play in the physical world, playing on playgrounds, being exposed to a little bit of risk at times. And we've kind of removed a lot of that from children's upbringings, especially with smartphones and social media. And so I'm planning on taking an approach where I'm going to be very light on smartphone technology usage to really give him a kind of pure upbringing where he can explore the world for himself.
Yeah, I love that. Also, a lot of strings to pull from for the upcoming conversation. So we have all the people, most people here. So I think maybe what makes more sense is Gaurai, that you briefly introduce yourself, the role, and what you do at Daybreak today as well.
Sure. So I'm the Vice President of Care Operations at Daybreak, and I'm responsible for all post-revenue operations. What that involves is clinical care, which means clinicians, care delivery, clinical quality, and clinical outcomes, but also capacity operations, clinical recruiting, onboarding, training, and retention of clinicians, health plan operations, and customer support operations. But honestly, I mean, beyond all of this, I really think about my role more in terms of a clinical and operational contributor to the exec team for strategic company decisions and planning. But much, much more importantly, what I really take to heart is my role as a coach and mentor to my team, which honestly has very capable leaders. And my job is really to be the catalyst for that leadership growth so that they scale up, take on additional responsibilities, and I eventually fire myself from the job.
I love that. That's definitely an example of a no ego approach. So Laura, can you also introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the Vice President of Product management here at Daybreak. I've been in product for a while now. Started out at Uber, transitioned to Spring Health, which is another mental health care company for employers. And now at Daybreak Health, where we provide youth with mental health services through our partnerships with schools. I think of my job in two ways that have to come together and work together. The first way is I think about all the users of Daybreak. And now, often when we think users, we think patients. Patients are indeed very important to Daybreak, but we have many other users as well. Clinicians, we have school staff who use our Daybreak platform as well, and we have internal users. And so I think about my job as creating an experience that our end users love so much that they would recommend Daybreak to others. Now, the other angle in which I think about my job that has to fit in with that first angle is internalizing Daybreak's goals. Where are we trying to go as a company? Are we trying to grow revenue? If so, how so? Are we trying to improve margins, profitability? If so, how so? And how do we fiercely prioritize so that we reach those goals in a way that's really paying attention to user experience?
Yeah, I like that definition of product management. So thank you for that. And also, if you see me typing like crazy, I just like to type when people speak, because then I can remember more what they are saying and connect the dots as well. So Laura, you mentioned the Daybreak care model a little bit already. Can you maybe, and Gaurai, also feel free to tap in. So can you maybe first talk about that a little bit more, and then also talk about the North Star metric that you have as an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of ground us all and remind us all of what Daybreak does, our mission is to provide mental health support for as many children as possible. And we all know there's a huge need. And, you know, referencing the book that I mentioned earlier in The Anxious Generation, it mentions that upwards of 30 to 40% of youth in today's society have a need for mental health care support. And so the Daybreak approach is that and I would say this is our secret sauce, we have figured out how to partner with school districts. So for example, the New York School District has about 1 million students. So we partner with the school district to tell them about Daybreak and what we offer. We then kind of get our name in front of the students, get our name in front of the families, and when they have a need, they can raise their hand and say, I'll sign up and I'll enroll my child into mental health services through Daybreak. There's much more to the picture, and every team plays a critical role in this model. But when I think about Daybreak's North Star metric, and I think North Star metrics are so important for grounding a company around what is the one thing that we're trying to drive together. I would say it's the number of patients that we serve. And every team has a critical role to play in that, including sales, partnerships, account management, operations, clinical operations, and engineering. But we're trying to maximize the number of patients that we serve and help make feel better over time.
And so, Gaurai, you obviously have a lot of experience in like operational efficiency. So do you have as an ops team, do you have the same North Star metric, or is it more like the number of patients we serve, but also taking margins into account? Or how are you looking at that from your perspective?
I think you said it well. I'm absolutely focused on our company's North Star metric as to how many kids are we able to help, how many kids are we serving. But then as an operational leader, it's important for me to also look at, what is the cost per session? Because the only way we can really serve the youth that we want to serve is if we are able to sort of, have healthy margins. That's the truth of it. That's how we can scale, and that's how we can become bigger. And to me, the cost per session sort of includes everything from patients being matched with the right clinicians, sort of getting started on their therapeutic journey as quickly as we can, do this. But it also is about our ability to scale sustainability while focusing on reducing clinician administrative costs and sort of non-clinician overhead cost. So for me, I think those two are top of mind.
And so when we spoke a few weeks back in preparation of this call, you mentioned that most care organizations are not focusing on clinical efficiency early enough, and that they should do that much earlier. And I think you're one of the operators that I know that is really, really focused on that, like those gross margin plays. So can you maybe explain why it's important to focus on that efficiency sooner rather than later within healthcare?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me put it in the context of, let me put it in the context of Daybreak. Our mission is around creating a world where every young person can access and benefit mental health support. And then as soon as we internalize that and look at the North Star metric of supporting, the largest number of youth that we can, it becomes important to focus on clinician efficiency versus throwing a lot of humans at it, because the more efficient your clinician supply, the more youth you can support. Similarly, clinician efficiency means there are less manual workflows, and that leads to lower cost per session. Let me give you an example of how Laura and I are currently working and investing in clinician efficiency by improving on our staff check-in workflow. But maybe first I should provide a little bit of context around this. One of Daybreak's referral channels is school districts, wherein school counselors refer students to us. And our clinical program emphasizes that the clinicians need to keep the patients as well as the referring staff member informed about progress made in those sessions. This takes the form of a clinician emailing the school staff at a certain cadence in the student's journey for either a video visit or an email check-in or something along those lines. But when Laura, I, and Diana, who's our VP of Core Revenue and Growth, started talking about it, it was pretty apparent from the feedback that we were getting that most of these check-ins did not really require a human in it. Majority of the school staff really wanted to know where our students were in the care journey and what their recent assessment scores, GAD-7, PHQ-9 scores were looking like. This can really be easily solved by creating a dashboard that allows the staff to visually follow that student's journey, in care. And we obviously are also wanting to keep the option open for that staff member to escalate it by asking for a face-to-face check-in with the therapist if they wanted granular information or sort of wanted to raise another concern. And I think, to me, this new flow speaks more about customer pull, where you're only involving the clinician when there is a pull from the customer versus a push, which is what our initial workflow was. And this ultimately then leads to clinician efficiency. So I think constantly focusing on where can I reduce the load on the clinician ends up serving our population of youth that we want to serve and also reduces the cost of care.
It's I love that perspective, because indeed what we have been talking about in healthcare for the past years is we need to focus on the patient outcomes and the patient and the patient and the patient. But essentially what you need to do is you need to focus on the clinicians, and essentially happy clinicians will lead to the happier patient that you just mentioned as well.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
so, Laura, obviously part of the efficiency game is not having a good VP of CareOps, it's also having a good VP of product that can design software that can help to enhance those efficiencies. So can you maybe briefly, like high level, explain the tech stack or like the vision that you have from like a tech stack perspective to deliver care and streamline those efficiencies?
Yeah, absolutely happy to. And Rick, I love what you just said. And that was a learning that I had at Spring Health. It was crystal clear to me that, patients they're not asking for fancy mobile apps and fancy websites to get access to their care. They are mostly looking for a reliable, smooth experience to enter the therapy sessions that could benefit them. And so that was a big learning that we had at Spring Health. But to answer your question, so the tech stack, and it's a very timely topic for us here at Daybreak. When I joined about a year ago, think of it as multiple microservices and vendors that were all attempting to work together and do a job well for Daybreak. But as many individuals here probably know, that microservices and tacking them together can break down. And so we were seeing that our tech stack, which is primarily built on top of Salesforce Health Cloud as our primary EHR, we were seeing that it was breaking down. It was very cumbersome to make changes to. We were seeing unreliability. We were seeing data issues because there was a data source of truth in each of these 5 areas that were, hosting different functionality for the business. And so when our new VP of engineering joined about 6 months ago, he came in and we decided that we would simplify, and we would bring our EHR in-house. What we do here at Daybreak, yes, it's complex, especially operationally, but from a technical standpoint, there was an opportunity to simplify so that we can create a better and easier experience for our clinicians, for our patients, et cetera. And just to give you an example of the impact here, we recently learned that because our EHR is so cumbersome and difficult to use for our clinicians, we learned that not all clinicians are logging in every time they have an appointment. And I don't blame them. Like back at Spring, when we talked to clinicians, these individuals are busy. They are juggling multiple platforms, going from appointment to appointment. And so what we learned is that we have an opportunity to make it so much easier for them to do their job efficiently, to log in, get their notes written, et cetera. And in turn, we can kind of build the revenue that we need to kind of continue to grow as a business.
Does that also mean that like the vast majority of the 2024 roadmap is focused on enhancing the homegrown EHR and the workflows within? Or like how do you balance the need of like improving that in-house EHR while also improving the patient outcomes or the patient experience in itself as well?
That is such a good question, Rick. We have taken an approach where I would say it's 70-30, where we're putting most of our eggs into building this homegrown EHR. We have almost like a SWAT team spun up that's moving as swiftly and quickly as possible. And that team is led by our VP of engineering. Meanwhile, I am kind of managing that 30% where we're still making small improvements to drive patient outcomes, clinical outcomes on the existing system, but we're being really selective about what do we invest in, knowing that we're going to have a rehaul pretty soon.
Yep, I like that approach. And then so obviously the problem with B2B healthcare, based on my conversations, is that you have like this care pathway that you have designed for mental health, where like you have a PHQ-9, and if you have this score, then we need to have a flag added to the EHR, and then we need to act whatever. The problem is that every B2B client that you sell to thinks they are unique snowflakes. So someone wants to have a threshold of a PHQ-9 of 15, and then another one wants to have 16. But me as a clinician, I don't want to remember all of these workflows. Like, oh, this is a patient from this school district, so I need to do this. Then this is a patient from another school district. So maybe a question to you, Gaurai, how do you like balance this need of like standardization, but also with these needs of client-specific customizations? Because me as a sales team, I want to sell customizations because that will make my life much easier. But you as an ops leader, you don't want these customizations. So how are you thinking about that balance?
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic question because when you work in the startup space, it is always very challenging, and especially the young startup like Daybreak, it can be challenging to drive standardization. And like you said, often one has to bend over backwards and accommodate custom requests in order to gain those contracts. These ultimately add to manual flows for the care and support teams, and particularly so for the clinicians, which is why I'm very, very proud of how Daybreak in the early days sort of put in the work to design a patient care as well as care support workflow that was a standard offering. And that is what our sales team speaks to when they're talking with new customers. Daybreak sort of took the time to design a 12-week structured clinical program that not only sort of includes what do we do clinically, but also includes collecting necessary intake information through structured client and customer support outreach. There are customer support interventions sort of woven into that, as well as parent and staff communications that sort of cater to the vast majority of the clients that are referred to us. And we have also seen that it leads to a huge, sort of improvement in their assessment scores within 6 to 8 sessions. That said, we are not completely immune to customization asks, and there's a lot more that we can do to drive standardization, sort of, and create a much more sustainably growing organization. I think the way to start thinking about any new ask is with the question, why? Laura is very, very good with thinking about customer requests for customized flows and sort of digging deep to find out where is this ask coming from. Like, are they asking for a certain threshold of PHQ 9 or GAD7 because it's coming from a place where they want to see their child, referred child doing better? What is it? What is the root cause of where that ask is coming from? And I feel like when Laura and the rest of us come together to design that versus just the customization that was asked for by the customer upfront and taking that at face value, then that well thought out design solution can sort of be applied to all customers and serves a larger cohort of customers, creating sort of a different way of looking at standardization, where yes, you do look at the customer asks, but then sort of dig down and really see what needs to be done and what can be applied to the larger population that we are serving. And that becomes the new standard for us. Laura is fantastic with doing that. She will invariably, when you ask her or when you tell her, hey, Laura, I think my clinicians need this, she'll be like, let's think about it. And, then we get into this conversation. So she sort of makes me slow down how I think about things as an operator. Maybe Laura, you can explain more on this as well.
Yeah. I think to your point, Gaurai, I think it's always asking the question of what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and up-leveling to that instead of the specific custom request that is being given. And the reason there is, most of the time, and I love our customers, but most of the time, people don't know exactly what is the best way to solve a problem, but they have a need. So going back to an earlier example that Gaurai mentioned, school staff who are ultimately the buyers of Daybreak, they sometimes have the need for a bit more clinical information about a student's care journey. So they were requesting more check-ins and more appointments with our clinicians, but that actually wasn't the best and most scalable solution to the problem that we're trying to solve, which is visibility and reassurance for our buyers. And so we approached it with much more of a tech-first approach and kind of pulling that data for them to see on their own time. I think the other thing that is really important to mention is just as a company, getting really comfortable with saying no. Like X customer asked for this thing, but it really doesn't make sense for us to entertain on our roadmap. And if we were to, an important initiative would have to drop off of the roadmap. And what I found in the course of my career to date is that more often than not, saying no is okay and acceptable, and that the customer will find another way to kind of fulfill their needs.
And so I have maybe two follow-up questions. The first one is like, so we have a lot of operators here in the room, and not sure who's the best person to answer this question, so I will let you tap in. And so they are probably dealing with this problem right now. So they don't have the culture that you have set as two leaders to say no and to think deeply about the why. So what advice would you give them? So let's say that tomorrow the sales team comes back to them again and says like, hey, I need this customization, please get it done. Like, what advice would you give to push back on that and indeed apply the principles that you just explained there?
Yeah. I can start, Gaurai, and then feel free to tap in. So my advice and my take is not that one should say no all the time. My take is that we should be really selective about what the company works on. Every company has limited resources just by nature, by design. And so when someone brings an ask to me, the first thing that I think about is, why is this ask important for Daybreak's business and the goals that we're trying to achieve? And so let's say, and maybe we use an example here. A couple months ago, we invested in this algorithm that in a very smart way matches a bunch of students who have signed up for Daybreak to a bunch of clinicians, and it's called batch match, and it matches all of them at the same time based on a bunch of attributes. So when I think about why that's important for the company, one, it reduces time to care for our patients. And that's a really important metric because, you know, it can take upwards of weeks to get them into care. So if we can shrink that, it's great. Two, we can increase clinician retention by getting them more kind of appointments and patients at a faster pace. And so when I think about those things, I'm like, okay, it's important to Daybreak. And that gives me more of a lens into perhaps we should prioritize solving this problem. The other thing that I would recommend is just keeping a stack rank of here are all the things your team is working on. And if we were to prioritize this batch match algorithm, and it's a little bit unpredictable, but we think it's important for the company, be really explicit about what priority has to drop or needs to be delayed. And so at that point, it becomes more of a conversation around trade-offs and less of a conversation around we can't do it. And that becomes a much more productive conversation.
Yeah, I love that. And then so the problem obviously in most organizations is that whenever the sales team sells customizations to a workflow, it doesn't impact product that much because it's essentially a new PDF that lives somewhere in the intranet that the clinician need to go to and like, okay, this is a New York patient district. So now I need to do this. Oops, I have a different patient. I need to open this different PDF. So Gaurai, how are you thinking? Like, what advice would you give to those people that are dealing with these sales requests that don't require product work, but that will burden your care team significantly and also your ops team?
Yeah. I think it's also about, again, prioritization and trade-offs. Some customer requests are connected heavily to what our, NRR percent could be, or, sort of is connected to a contract renewal that is coming up. And suddenly there's a revenue impact that we're talking about. So that's one framework to use. The other is, what is the trade-off? If I do this, if I ask my care team, to sort of take on this particular customized request, which is very manual, then what am I taking off their plate? Because I have finite number of resources. I don't have the budget or the money to go and hire, more headcount in order to fulfill this particular request. So it's about prioritization, it's about trade-offs, and it's ultimately for me is about not adding the manual workflow on the clinician plate, but potentially adding it on the care support team plate, because my clinicians are a largely 1099 workforce, which means, again, like Laura was saying, they are working on a variety of platforms with a variety of different behavioral health startups. And I can't add this to their plate because on one hand, will they do it? Sure. Can I pay them for it? Maybe. But will they remember to do it? Like, there is a cognitive burden that we are adding on the clinician's plate, which I think we need to take away. So the idea is we prioritize, we talk about trade-offs as a company, as a team, and three, try and move that manual workflow onto the care support team versus putting it on the clinician's plate.
Yeah. I would add a quick fourth, and Gaurai and I have been partnering here. We've started to build a muscle around informing the sales team what to sell instead of receiving 100 different flavors of deals to support. Right. And so the more that Gaurai and I can work together and define, for example, we're defining that school staff can now get amazing visibility into a care journey for each student via our school staff portal. They're then creating a slide in the sales deck and putting that in front of districts. And, districts, it works for them. They're like, this is great. I would love visibility on my own time. And so we're starting to create that kind of alignment at the top of the sales funnel, instead of receiving them at the bottom.
Totally. It's basically about creating this whole integrated system where we are not just looking at are we meeting our sales targets or not, but are we selling with the point of view of retaining that customer and renewing the contract year after year? Because if you just focus on the sales, I mean, you can say yes to every customization that comes through, but given that the rest of the company then has to sort of, do all of those manual workflows, and when there's manual workflow, there are errors, which means then there is an impact on contract renewal, and there's definitely an impact on customer as well as client satisfaction. So the idea is look at it as an integrated system versus looking at just meeting sales targets.
I love that approach. And then so again, the problem with most care organizations is that you have like silos between the sales team and then mostly like the product team that work together nicely, but then the sales team like throws deals over the wall and it's like, hey, we signed this deal, we promise these features. So what advice would you give to care teams or care organizations where there is friction between those two teams? Because at Daybreak it looks very it's all going well, but I assume that you have maybe experience elsewhere where it's not the case. So what advice can you give to marry those teams together more so you can indeed create the engagements that you just described? Because I think they're very important.
I would say breaking down silos, but much more importantly, leaning into your radical candor muscle. And I'm going back to the book that I sort of, I recommended, being radically candid about where you think things are broken. And I think it's extremely important at the exec team level to be able to do that, where we are able to say out loud that, hey, this is not making sense. I understand that you are doing this to bring in more, sales contracts. Fantastic. And this is adding a ton load of additional work and cost. So which means our margins are suffering. Even though your revenue might be growing, our cost per session is really going significantly up. And this is not a sustainable way to grow. And we've had those conversations. So while Laura and I are talking about everything is great, I think the exec team is very, very invested, including our sales leader, including our CEO, Alex, where we are ready to have these, sort of difficult conversations and come out. And the intent always, and everyone knows this, the intent always is how does Daybreak do better? How do we serve the youth population better? So I think that helps.
Yeah, I like that angle. Laura, maybe a question to you. So you obviously have seen hyperscale at Spring Health, and now you're also seeing a lot of growth in Daybreak Health. So if you look at, for example, the employee count, how fast that's growing for Daybreak, it looks amazing. So are there certain areas from a product perspective that you didn't take into account at Spring Health that you immediately acted on when joining Daybreak?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of things come up, but I think the biggest one, and everyone at Daybreak's probably tired of me using these words because I use them so much, is this concept of KPI-driven product development. That's something that I back at Spring Health led this charge about 2 years into my journey there. The company was already, I want to say 800 employees, so quite large. We realized that we can't just go down a laundry list and build product. And, we built this feature, check. We changed that button, check. That kind of product development does not have an eye towards what is the metric, what is the impact that we're trying to drive. And course correcting for that flavor of product development when the company was already 800 employees was very challenging. The processes, the org structure, but most importantly, the culture of thinking about problem solving and product development in that way was a multi-quarter initiative. It was sweat and tears. And so at Daybreak, when I joined, the first thing that I talked to our CEO, Alex, about was that we need to start building a KPI-driven product development muscle. And, at the time we were maybe 40 employees, so it was much more doable to start building that muscle. And we started measuring everything, including the patient funnel. So how many students do we reach? How many do we then sign up? How many do we get to their first care appointment? And then ongoing engagement and clinical outcomes. And to give you a small example, we saw that, our patients, only 40% of them were giving us insurance information, which is lose-lose across the board because they have insurance coverage. We can bill insurance, and so it would be much more affordable for everyone if we received that information and could act on it. So we saw that data point. We then made some very small changes to the form in which we collected insurance information. It's copy changes. It was a little bit of product design and UI, and then a little bit of positioning. Where and when do we ask for that information? We were able to increase that to 60% collection with just a little bit of work. And so that's an example of KPI-driven product development that I believe greatly in.
And so how does it then, so let's say that Gaurai has like a product problem, because we're not talking about features, it has a problem to be solved.
Oh.
What's then the process that you follow? It's the clinical or the ops team brings a problem, and then you try to quantify the problem in KPIs, or how do I need to see that?
That's a great question. It's much more of an art than it is a science of, I don't have a spreadsheet where I'm doing math around every problem that people bring to me, but it's in my head. Like, I'm constantly thinking about, why are we solving this problem? Is it a revenue generator? Is it margins? Is it something else? And then I can loosely in my brain figure out, is it a big problem? Is it a small problem? But then once we have agreed as an organization to solve that problem, the product managers on my team, they're setting KPIs. Like, if we solve this problem well, the percentage of insurance collected should increase. Here's our target. We want to get it to 50%. And then we experiment with some changes and monitor that impact on our key KPIs over time. The other thing that I like about this approach is that it also gives us a sense of when we can stop focusing on this problem. We can optimize insurance collection for the rest of our lives, but there's so many other problems to solve. And so getting it from 40 to 60% gave us comfort that we can move on to the next problem for now.
Yeah, I like that. And so Gaurai, it's clear that from a product perspective, Daybreak is always running like this experimentation mindset. But when we spoke, you also talked about like your fail fast experiments. So can you maybe briefly explain to the audience what you mean by that, and how you have structured that at Daybreak?
Sure. Let me maybe walk you through the journey around fail fast experiments. When I first used the word fail fast experiments, my team in previous organizations reacted with a lot of worry and a lot of questions. I think for me, again, fail fast, that concept to me came from what Amazon was doing, and reading some of the books and some of the concepts that Jeff Bezos was bringing into Amazon. To me personally, I think fail fast is one of the most powerful mindset changes, and sort of provides profound freedom in our work, but also in our relationships with others, in our personal lives, and in our relationship with ourselves. I think if you treat virtually everything in your lives, work or personal, as an experiment, and focus on learning and growing from those experiences, it can be extremely empowering and freeing at the same time. But let me maybe bring it down to an example at Daybreak. So we landed this big contract with a health plan, but one that came with an expectation that the clinician should be using their systems versus the standard Daybreak ones. Now, we also needed access to clinical outcomes and session metrics data to track utilization and other metrics and see how we were doing there. But that meant that the clinicians would need to duplicate some minimal documentation in both systems until product could weave its magic, until Laura could come in and say, okay, this is how we are going to do this better, and this is how we take it off the clinician's plate. But then how do you ask a largely 1099 clinician workforce to do this and ensure cost efficiency, and as well as, sort of honestly clinician retention as well? So we experimented with this W-2 full-time salaried model, only to find out that making margins work required clinicians to open up, 30 slots per week. Seems easy enough, right? For a 40-hour work week, until you realize that kids only want appointments during after school hours. And there aren't enough hours between 3 and 8 p.m. on weekdays to make this possible. Maybe with some clinicians who are willing to work evenings and weekends, but really it was hard to pull that off. So we then rejigged the hiring to a 1099 hybrid model for meeting the demand from those health plan clients. This allowed us to hire the supply, have them immediately seeing sort of our school clients until they were credentialed under that health plan, which can take anywhere from 2 to 3.5 months. But then the downside to this model is that in that 2 to 3 months wait, the clinician's caseload is sort of pretty full with those school clients that they are seeing, which is the other referral channel. And it can take additional time to wrap up these clients, discharge them when clinically indicated, which added further delay to then meeting the health plan demand. Also, given the need for the separate workflows for, do this workflow for schools, do this workflow for the health plan clients, it adds to cognitive burden. So then we said, okay, this is not working. So let's create a W-2 part-time model, but with full benefits, because that then allows the clinicians income and benefit stability, and we get dedicated capacity for the health plan referrals. Now, for this iteration of the experiment, one of the most important things that we are keeping an eye on is recruiter feedback. How is the role and the JD landing in the market? What feedback are we getting from the candidates? How should we benchmark the utilization of this role, etc.? This experiment is live right now, and the jury is really out on this latest iteration. And I have a feeling that we will need to continue tweaking this model until we find the right fit that serves our clinicians, serves our patients, but also our business.
I love that example. And it also showcases the power of the mindset. So thank you for sharing that. One problem with the mindset of experimentation is also that it comes with chaos. And so what are some of the working principles or practices that really guide that collaboration between ops, clinical, and the product team at Daybreak to put that chaos into something beautiful? Maybe Laura, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, that sounds great. My answer here will be short because we've already covered a lot of my guiding principles. I think the two main things that come to mind really orient around the problem that we're trying to solve instead of, random requests that come from different individuals. Once you get a cross-functional team on the same page about the problem that we're trying to solve, that then leads to brainstorming around how to solve the problem and then executing on the problem. And those two things are so much more straightforward once there is clarity around the problem that we're trying to solve. The second thing is really fierce prioritization. It could be anyone at the company who brings this to the company, but this culture of knowing what's important to the business, focusing on those things, saying no to projects that are simply distracting. And this will create an environment in which everyone, whether it's a person on the ops team or product team or sales team, can have the bandwidth and energy to solve the most important problems for the company.
Yeah.
And so from a practical perspective, does that mean that you have like weekly syncs with the ops team and the clinical team, or like do you have clinicians that, for example, beta test new releases, or how like practically speaking,
Yeah.
what are some tactics there that you have used? And then Gaurai, the question will come to you after that as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in later. Yeah.
That's a great question. I think three main tactics come to mind for me. One, and this sounds simple, but I think it's really, really important. Gaurai and I have frequent one-on-ones. And this, I think it speaks to the importance of the executive team being really on the same page about the problems that we are solving this week and the approach towards them. And just to give you a quick example, Gaurai and I were working on creating some changes in clinical workflows over the past week. We aligned on a high-level approach so that our teams could drive it forward. And there was a little bit of disconnect on the team. You know, one person on the product team recommended approaching it one way. One person in the ops team recommended approaching it a different way. She and I quickly, it took 5 seconds to connect and say, this is the approach that we agree on. We got on the same page, communicated it back out, and then our teams were able to execute on that. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing is, for every large initiative that the company is working on for this quarter, and we do quarterly planning here at Daybreak, generally we have a weekly slot, a weekly meeting where the most important cross-functional players for that initiative are meeting and coming together. It's not a meeting to report out on progress. It's not a share out meeting. It is a meeting to work through what needs to get done this week, blocking and tackling. And imagine if we were in an in-person office environment. It's everyone coming together in a room, making progress, helping each other out, and then going back to their desks to execute for the rest of the week. And so those are two kind of tactics that have worked well at Daybreak.
Yeah. Let me sort of bring that home with talking about sort of the underlying foundation, with how, what is our guiding way of sort of having a structure in place for these experiments or any work that we do together to collaborate. Obviously, there is the use of the usual project management principles and tools, but underneath that, I tend to think of it in the form of tiers. Tier 1 is sort of the decision-making center, which consists of strategists and decision makers, as well as the experiment or the P&L owner and the driver. This is where all decisions, program monitoring, KPI tracking, stakeholder buy-in, et cetera, is done. The next tier to that is the center of execution, as I like to think about it, which consists of the SWAT team, or the key responsible stakeholders who are executing on the experiment and sort of, getting it done every single day. The execution team does not necessarily own strategy or roadmaps, but is sort of delivering on those. And these are owned by, meaning the strategy and the roadmaps are sort of owned by the center of decision making, which which is the tier 1. And then there is the tier 3 to this, which is really the individual teams like the health plan operations team or the revenue cycle team or clinical operations, product engineering, who are then taking the learnings from what the center of execution is doing and incorporating it into a scalable workflow. This is fairly similar to, I think, Rick, what you talk about in your blog, which is, design, validate, build, operate, monitor, prove, and then the back again loop. So I think I look at it very similarly too, just in the form of 3 tiers.
Yeah, I I like those 3 tiers a lot. I will dive into that, maybe rewatching the recording and then asking you a bit more questions on that as well, because I do think it's definitely a rabbit hole. I see we only have 9 minutes left, so maybe a few more questions on my end, and then the audience can obviously tap in as well. So Gaurai, the first question that I have for you, so you obviously worked at a previous mental health company that also saw rapid scale in many ways. So what are some of the processes that you maybe addressed at those companies but didn't address at Daybreak immediately? Or like put differently, what are some processes that you don't think require scalable and that you should keep unscalable because it's drastically impacting quality on care or any other metrics that you care about?
Yeah. It's funny that you asked that question, because the usual tendency in these panel conversations is to focus on what was done versus not done, or should not be done. I'm in operations in a startup, and that means I keep on saying this: cost per session, I think, is a pretty important metric for me. One of the cost line items that goes into this metric is clinician management and oversight cost, which is typically in the form of clinical or operations managers. It can look like a very high cost, and it truly is unscalable until you look at clinicians as human beings and not as robots that can deliver care by only sort of interacting with technical features and point solutions. Therapy, being a therapist myself in my previous role, therapy is incredibly hard on the clinician and can also be very isolating, especially in this remote world. I mean, yes, the desire to be well compensated for their efforts while being supported by technical tools to reduce the administrative burden is absolutely a need. But there is also a huge need that comes from the clinicians to feel supported and be part of a community that they can relate to and who empathizes, sort of with their experiences. Now, don't get me wrong. I strongly believe that this management cost can be drastically reduced, but I also feel it can only be done after we have created holistic oversight mechanisms and sort of self-serve dashboards and automated actionable notifications for clinicians to function independently. We are not there yet. Laura and I are working towards it. And until technology can support the clinicians to an extent that they don't need to regularly reach out for support in either patient care or navigating Daybreak systems, we cannot and should not be taking away the cost incurred for managing these clinician teams, but maybe instead optimize on that. And even then, I think it's very important to internalize, and I'll say this again, clinicians are not machines. They are the cornerstones of why we exist as a company, and that their retention and well-being is important for the success of our company. And I think for that, we need people and we need strategies that can focus on clinician engagement and retention and create a space where clinicians can feel valued. And ultimately, like you said, earlier, it leads to happy patients, satisfied customers, better clinical outcomes, and finally a growing top line as well.
And so, Laura, as we mentioned, or we discussed already quite a lot in this conversation as well, is that to drive that, the fact that you have happy providers, you also need the technology. And so you went from building everything on top of Salesforce to deciding to switch it and go homegrown. You probably have went through like a vetting process of like maybe looking at other EHRs, maybe buying something again off the shelf. And I get this question literally every week, like 5 times, like, hey, what EHR should I buy? Should I do it in-house? Should I like maybe based on the journey that you just went through, given the tech stack is so important, what are like some tips that you can share with the audience to take away?
That's a really good question. So a couple of things. One, there are so many EHR options that are out there that are pretty off the shelf. Some are more archaic, have been around for decades, and the UI also looks like it's been around for decades. Those are a little bit harder to customize and manipulate. There are also EHR options and EMR options that they're almost like there's startups who have created an EMR and EHR for other startups. Those are easier to manipulate, a bit more fungible. And so my kind of takeaway from the process, the vetting process that we went through is really think about what is your company trying to do? What does the care model look like? How standard is it? And will these off-the-shelf options take your company from today to 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? And if so, then it probably doesn't make a ton of sense to build an EHR in-house because it's not an easy initiative. That said, if there's something quite unique about your offering that requires fungibility, customization, and will be difficult to achieve on top of an off-the-shelf option, building an EHR is difficult, but it's not impossible. And I've actually spoken to many health tech startups who have brought it in-house for the same reasons that we have. And so just do a little bit of research and evaluation with those criteria. Either option's fine. And one of my takeaways is like, don't try to plan for the next 50 years of this business. Just think about the next 5 years. Where's the company going? What level of scale are we trying to support? And pick an option that's good for the foreseeable future. It doesn't need to work for infinite scale.
Yeah, I like that approach, and does that also mean, because we talked a lot about, like, for example, Oak Street Health or Carbon Health, or like Oak Street Health is a good example. They built like a sort of like CRM on top of the EHR to be compliant with, for example, regulatory things. And so something that I'm very bullish on is like the composable architecture, that you build some stuff, but they also use off-the-shelf like scheduling tools or workflow, like all of that. Is that also how you're looking at it, or is it more not composability that you're trying to achieve, and more like we will build everything on our end and that's it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We are, even though we're building the EHR in-house, there are certain pieces of functionality that, it's been tried and true, and there are many options out there. So we don't need to build in-house. So for example, as we are scaling up the business and need to collect availability from our clinicians, and right now we do it, one, it's fairly manual, and two, it's not updated often enough, which has downstream impacts. So when we think about bringing our EHR in-house, we are using vendors who can make that integration between our EHR and a clinician's calendar super easy. And again, going back to our earlier conversation, the easier we can make it for clinicians, the better chance we have to provide a great patient experience as they attend their appointments. And so the way to think about our new tech stack is we're bringing the core in-house. So patients, school districts, organizations, appointments, we're bringing all of that core in-house, but the composability of the functionality that's required, sometimes we are contracting with vendors to be able to service those pieces.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes a lot of sense. So thank you for sharing those insights. I see we only have 1 minute left, and so maybe a final question to both of you, a very short one. Gaurai, starting with you, what final advice would you give to someone that is listening to this panel today, and in your case is an operational leader or a clinical leader, and wants to apply some of the things that you've discussed today in their company tomorrow?
I'll be quick. I think focus on the learning and being effective versus focusing on meeting or exceeding a KPI target. The more you focus on learning, the better you are understanding the underlying levers, and then easier it will be to achieve the goals and targets. So just focus on learning and growth, and everything else will fall in place.
I love that. Laura, what about you?
I mean, mine is actually very much in line with Gaurai's, and we did not prepare this. Mine is really around, focus, and this is from more of a product lens, but focus on learning about your users. And so if you're in part of the organization that interfaces with patients, talk to them, learn what their biggest problems are, learn how, what their day-to-day looks like, so that you can design product, but also workflows that work well for each user type. Of course, this applies for clinicians as well. And really a learning that I've had during my career is it's dangerous to make assumptions about users and their biggest problems and how to solve them. And so I think our theme for the day is learning from slightly different angles.
I love that. And for the audience, thank you, and feel free to drop your feedback of today's panel in this Google form. If you do so, I will send you a CareOps t-shirt, not the one that I'm wearing today, but the one with the logo and everything. And Laura and Gaurai will also follow up with you to so you can also rock that t-shirt. But thank you so much for sharing all the wisdom. I actually got 4 LinkedIn messages during the panel of people saying, hey, I'm listening to this conversation right now, and it's extremely insightful. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you for what you're doing for the mental health of children and young people, and keep up the good work. And see you next time.
Thank you
for
so
inviting
much.
us. I think we had a lot of fun.
Thank
Had a
you.
lot of
Bye-bye.
fun. Thank you, Rick.